Take the exit. Turn right into the drive-thru.
Nope, I'm making dinner tonight.
You don't have time. Josh has practice.
Oh, that's right. I'll just get a salad.
And fries?
No, just the salad.
But salad cancels fries.
Salad only.
Fries.
Salad.
Fries.
Food noise isn't fair, but Mochi Health is. The affordable GLP-1 source that puts you on the road to successful weight loss.
Hey, can I get the...
Fries.
Salad. Sorry.
Learn more at joinmochi.com. Mochi members have access to licensed physicians and nutritionists. Results may vary.
You might not realize this, but there was almost a world in which there was no Jane Austen. Or at the very least, no Jane Austen novels. No Pride and Prejudice. No Sense and Sensibility. And if you think about it, that means there might not have been all of this Regency media that we love. Would Regency romance be such a bestseller if there was no Jane Austen? You see, childhood was a dangerous time for people in the late 18th century. Jane almost didn't survive hers. When Jane was just 7 years old, she was sent away to live with a relative. That decision almost cost her life. That relative, for reasons still unknown today, took Jane to the city of Southampton, which was ravaged by a typhus epidemic. Now, as a historian, I had heard of typhus, but as somebody who generally gets squicked out from medical history, I had never really gone too deep into the subject. But as I learned more and more about it, I realized what a horrific disease little Jane had survived. Typhus starts with a headache and a high fever. Jane may have lost her appetite or felt extreme fatigue. Around day 5 to 7, a rash develops. It would start pale and quickly darken as blood vessels swell and break beneath the skin. Sometimes the rash can even weep blood. After a week, the fever can return or even worsen with bouts of delirium. And then, one by one, the body's organs shut down. It is known as a putrid fever because of the way that the living body seems to rot from within. Bed sores erupt from the skin, and the sufferer exhales a foul, odorous breath. The disease lasts about 14 days. That is, if you survive. Epidemic typhus can kill up to 60% of those it afflicts. And if Jane's caretaker wanted to seek aid, she may have found it difficult. Hospitals and infirmaries of the era regularly shut their doors to cases of putrid fever. There was no accepted cure either. Jane may have been bled, which was a common practice at the time, or hot glasses may have been pressed to her skin in a practice known as cupping. Some doctors might prescribe vinegar baths or even shave the heads of their patients. And yet, to the delight of millions today, Jane survived. This episode is one that punctuated a crucial time in Jane's life. Between the ages of 7 and 10, Jane would receive the bulk of her formal education. These years also marked the only time in her life when she lived away from her family. These experiences lay the foundation for the rest of Jane's life. From her near brush with death to the unusual cast of women who shaped her literary interests, Jane's school years were more than just a footnote in the history of our heroine. No, here we find the first inklings of the author who would emerge. And strangely enough, for such an intellectual woman, her greatest education seemed to come not from her eccentric teachers or the 18th century curriculum, but from the experiences that shaped her childhood. This is Finding Jane Austen, Episode 3, All the Masters Necessary. I'm your host, Dr. Ann Ferdig. The January of 1783 was a wet one. The naturalist, Gilbert White, who lived not far from the Austen family, described days of driving rain and the ground full of water. The roads in this part of Hampshire were a mud bath on the best of days. No doubt now that they were nearly drenched. But, having traveled to meet her sister just a few months before, Jane had proved herself adept at traveling through the countryside. Unlike some of their neighbors, Mr. Austen would not purchase a carriage until the 1790s, which he eventually had to sell. And so, from a young age, Jane was accustomed to walking. Jane's world at this time was made up of a series of Hampshire villages. If she wandered north up the main road that cut through Steventon, she would reach Dean. There, the coach at Dean Gate Inn took advantage of the highway that bisected the village. Take this road east, and you would reach the town of Basingstoke. One day, Jane would travel to Basingstoke for balls and shopping. But at age 7, her independence was a bit more confined. Just west of Dean, meanwhile, was a place a little more local to a girl of 7, the village of Ash. The rector of Ash had just passed away the previous January. The Austen family had more than a passing acquaintance with him. Mr. Austen's uncle had bought the living of Ash to give him once the current rector, Dr. Russell, left it. But now Dr. Russell was dead, and Mr. Austen, with 2 parishes, a school, and a flock of children under his responsibility, likely passed on the opportunity. Regardless, Dr. Russell's wife was moving out with their daughter, a teenaged girl named Mary Russell, who never liked Jane, and, by her own testimony, never would. This might seem like a small event in the life of Jane, inconsequential really, but it would lead to something that would have great impact on the rest of her life. In the Russells' place arrived a new family. They were an Irish family with a French name, the Lefroys. Dr. Lefroy was to be the new rector of Ash Parish. Although British-born, his wife would be known in the villages as Madame Lefroy. Whether Jane knew it or not, this connection would prove to be one of the most important in her lifetime. Now, to address the elephant in the room, for those of you who might think that the name Lefroy sounds a little familiar. If you know a little Austen lore, or if you've simply seen the movie Becoming Jane, you know of Tom Lefroy, Jane's infamous love connection and the most significant romantic interest that we know of. That's a really important caveat we'll discuss later this season. And yes, he is a relation of these Lefroys. But forget about Tom for now. He's not important yet, and depending on which scholar you ask, he never was important. I know, that's a hot take. But just trust me for now. Tom will come up later. But do you know who was important? Madame Lefroy. You see, some people thought little Jane too silly, too affected, too overly imaginative for her age. But not Madame Lefroy. She was delighted by Jane's machinations. Perhaps Madame Lefroy saw something of herself in the young girl. Born Anne Bridges, she had been the eldest of 10 children. Described as a great reader, she had begun writing poetry at a young age, and quickly found that her poetry could be used to entertain and teach her younger siblings. She didn't marry until she was 31 years old, to George Lefroy, who moved her first to Basingstoke and then to the house at Ash. Dr. George Lefroy was the son of an Italian marble merchant. He and Madame Lefroy filled their home with marble statues, Italian medals, Roman coins, and other tokens of the Mediterranean. The couple quickly dazzled their little corner of Hampshire. Madame Lefroy could recite all of the famous poets, Milton, Pope, even the sonnets of Shakespeare, which were far less popular than his plays at this point in time. Little Jane was fascinated by this adult woman, some 25 years her senior. Madame Lefroy loved to dance, as Jane loved to dance. Madame Lefroy rode horses and donkeys. As her brother, Sebastian, once testified,
"My sister was universally beloved and admired. She was fond of society and was the life of every party into which she entered."
There was something about Jane that fascinated Madame Lefroy as well. Perhaps it was Jane's own penchant for telling stories. Perhaps Jane shared her earliest poetical attempts with Madame Lefroy. Or perhaps Madame Lefroy shared her own poetical compositions with young Jane. Regardless, the two became fast friends. Sir Samuel Egerton Bridges, a relative of Madame Lefroy, would later recount,
I remember Jane Austen, the novelist, as a little child. She was very intimate with Mrs. Lefroy, and much encouraged by her. When I knew Jane Austen, I never suspected that she was an authoress, but my eyes told me that she was fair and handsome, slight and elegant, but with cheeks a little too full.
We must credit Madame Lefroy as one of many women who would play a substantial role in Jane's education. Unlike the boys in her father's school or her older brothers, Jane's education would be less formal and more social. It was not that she lacked any formal education, but that she learned as much from the people around her as she did from any school. Take her mother, Mrs. Austen. Mrs. Austen was highly intelligent and well-read herself. From a young age, she had displayed a precocious intelligence. At age 6, Uncle Theophilus declared Mrs. Austen the poet of the family, and the author of several so-called smart pieces. And Uncle Theophilus was no weak critic. He was the master of Balliol at Oxford University. Even in her middle age, Mrs. Austen's wit was always on display. When Mr. Austen's students acted up, she might even write them a poem to egg them on. But according to her granddaughter Anna, Mrs. Austen had no real formal education. Rather, Mrs. Austen largely had to find her own opportunities for education, as her daughters would after her. There's a suggestion that she was somewhat self-taught from the same books and poetry that would also inspire Madame Lefroy and Jane Austen. Cassandra, only a few years older, also likely proved an immeasurable influence on Jane. From the family, we know that they were already inseparable at this age. Who knows what Cassandra may have passed down to Jane in the wisdom she held as the elder sister. It is, of course, important to note that women, especially women from privileged households, did receive formal education in this period. In fact, women of the 18th century were more highly educated than arguably any generation before.
I think even reading Austen sometimes, you can get into this sort of mistaken idea that many women were only given these educations which were based on showy accomplishments. So, playing the harp or embroidery, drawing, which themselves are no mean feat. Some of the stuff that we have in the collections suggests how incredibly skilled women became at those arts. But there are also women who have really, really good educations. Women who are learning things like Greek, Hebrew, women who are reading the classics, which traditionally they were kind of barred from. So, yeah, I think it's a term that can mean lots of different things. But for me, it's women who have a beyond normal education. My name's Kim Simpson. I am the Deputy Director of Chawton House. So I look after academic programming, educational visits. Occasionally they let me curate an exhibition, which is one of the great pleasures of working here.
Dr. Simpson suggested to us that Austen thought deeply about women's education her entire life, and that her novels demonstrate her own ideas about what constitutes a woman's education. If you haven't read Pride and Prejudice, she is about to describe a moment between the heroine, Elizabeth Bennet, everyone's favorite love interest, Mr. Darcy, and a woman named Caroline Bingley, a wealthy, refined, but snobbish woman who also has her eye on Mr. Darcy.
There's that conversation in Pride and Prejudice, for example, with Mr. Darcy and Caroline Bingley, and they're talking about what an accomplished woman is. I think that's a deeply political moment where, Caroline Bingley, I think she's been to a wonderful finishing school and she's learned all of the kind of graceful arts of how one ought to be a woman. And she's very pointedly saying, women must be this and must be this. And then Mr. Darcy chimes in with, well, women must also be well-read and educated. And then Elizabeth chimes in with, all of these necessities mean that there are very few accomplished women because nobody could possibly meet all of these criteria. I think it's really interesting that Austen chooses Elizabeth Bennet as this woman who's not perfect, who hasn't had that kind of education, who's not accomplished, but who is smart and well-read. As her heroine, she allows her a kind of happy ending.
This is a very interesting scene because in many respects, it reflects Jane's own education. Later in the novel, we discover that Elizabeth Bennet never had dancing or drawing masters, nor did she have a governess to teach her. And she did not attend a school. But she was, quote, always encouraged to read and had all the masters that were necessary. I am not suggesting, by the way, that Jane saw herself as Elizabeth Bennet, but she always put a little bit of real life into her novels. And when we look at the sort of education that Jane did have, we can see why she valued the education of a good book over that of a formal schooling. Jane's first education would have taken place in the home. Like many women of the period, Mrs. Austen was responsible for providing the earliest education for her children. Before the Austen boys ever entered their father's library, after all, they would have been instructed in their numbers and letters by their mother. James, Edward, and Henry would all go on to attend Oxford. As for Jane, well, Jane would get an Oxford education, of a sort, just not the university kind. In April of 1783, Jane, Cassandra, and their cousin Jane Cooper were sent to a woman named Mrs. Colley. Mrs. Colley lived in Oxford. She was Jane Cooper's aunt and the widow of a prominent Oxford academic. Mr. Austen paid her a total of £40 to take care of Jane and Cassandra as a private tutor. The town of Oxford has, in some respects, always revolved around the university. The town itself in this period was a mishmash of architecture. Thick Norman walls, ornate Baroque facades, and the clean symmetry of the newer buildings, which we call today the neoclassical. It was a familiar town to the Austens. Mr. Austen had received his education there, and Mrs. Austen came from a long line of Oxford academics. James, the eldest Austen, was attending Oxford at the same time that his sisters arrived. While James may have patronized the smoky coffee houses and taverns that littered the city, Jane and Cassandra, as young, polite girls, would remain by Mrs. Colley's side. We don't know much about Mrs. Colley. Mrs. Colley had a reputation in the family as a stiff-mannered and formal individual. Her husband had passed away 6 years earlier, and she was forced to move from her elegant home provided by the college to make way for his successor. She likely found herself in reduced circumstances, and the families may have sent the girls to her as a way to provide her an income. While Mrs. Austen had likely already given the girls a basic education, with a full household of boys and a farm to manage, sending off Jane and Cassandra may have given her a little relief. Even less is known about what kind of education Mrs. Colley might provide the 3 young girls. Jane would receive a book of French fables for Christmas that year, so perhaps she picked up a bit of French from her. Handwriting would be standard too, perhaps some geography or history. But then, something unusual happened. For some reason, halfway through the year, Mrs. Colley vacated Oxford with the girls. Together, they left Oxfordshire and traveled south to Southampton. Southampton is the busy seaport south of Winchester. It sits firmly in Hampshire, more familiar territory to the Austen girls, but it was a far cry from rural Steventon. It was also far from Oxford, where Mrs. Colley had spent the majority of her adult life. What value was there for 3 young girls and a widow in Southampton? The likeliest answer I can think of is that Southampton did have a reputation as a spa town. Mineral-rich waters made the spa popular for bathers, and its proximity to the sea made it a good spot for leisure activities. Southampton in this period had theaters and an assembly room and all the pleasures of an 18th century city. But still, it's a bit odd. What we do know is that 2 things happened in September 1783. The first was that Jane, her sister, and her cousin arrived in Southampton. Second is that September is precisely the time when typhus broke out in the city. Typhus is spread by fleas and lice, and since the girls likely all shared one bed, it is no mystery how they all succumbed to it so quickly. The fever soon overtook all 3 girls. Mrs. Colley was unconcerned. Perhaps she didn't understand the seriousness of the disease. Perhaps she worried what the parents might think that the girls grew so sick under her care. Or maybe typhus had struck her as well. Whatever her reasons, she did not notify the Austens or the Coopers that their daughters were ill. But Jane Cooper, at 12 years old, understood something was very wrong. The younger Jane was ill, perhaps deathly so it was up to the elder Jane. Sick and feverish herself, she wrote a letter to her parents, notifying them of their condition. Mrs. Cooper and Mrs. Austen immediately left for Southampton to rescue their daughters. Once in Southampton, they removed the girls from Mrs. Colley's care. Still feverish, Jane and Cassandra were whisked back home to the care of their mother. But the mothers didn't just bring the girls home with them. They also brought the disease. It started with a headache and a high fever. And then Mrs. Cooper developed the rash. The blood darkened beneath her skin. After a week, delirium may have set in. And then her body began to shut down. On October 25th, 1783, Mrs. Cooper passed away of typhus. She was 47 years old. Jane and Cassandra both survived the fever. The death of her aunt was the first serious loss that Jane faced in her lifetime. It was sudden and tragic. Mrs. Austen must have been inconsolable. First, to almost lose her daughters, and then, in the rescue, to lose her sister. After the death of Mrs. Cooper, her widower, Dr. Cooper, gave Jane and Cassandra each a memento of their aunt. For Jane, it was a headband. The headband was a precious gift. Later in life, Jane would write of wearing it to balls, always keeping a piece of her aunt close to her. We have no record of how the family treated Mrs. Colley in the aftermath. There is only one clue. When Mrs. Colley died in 1787, her brother, Dr. Cooper, was the executor of her estate. But Dr. Cooper refused to touch the estate. Perhaps he wanted nothing to do with the woman whose actions led to his wife's death. The estate remained unresolved until after Dr. Cooper's own death. In early 1784, as spring emerged from the dead of winter, so too did the Austens emerge from mourning. They packed away their black mourning dresses and began the process of moving on. The questions of education for the girls were still open. Mr. Austen may have played around with the idea of finding them private tutors. At the very least, we know that he hired an artist, John Claude Natz, to teach the children of Steventon art. Natz would eventually become a well-regarded watercolorist. Of all the Austen children, it was Cassandra who would develop a taste for watercolors. Perhaps Natz had an influence on young Cassandra. Jane, on the other hand, does not seem to have developed a talent for visual arts. At 8 years of age, however, she would have begun gaining a taste for books. And Jane did not need to travel to Oxford to sate her love of books.
First of all, her father had a big library. I mean, big for a person in his situation. When they moved to Bath in 1801, when he retired, they auctioned off most of their possessions, maybe all of them practically, including books. And the auctioneer's advertisement listed 500 books, which might be about 200 titles. That's a pretty big collection. My name is Susan Allen Ford, and I'm Professor Emerita of English at Delta State University in Cleveland, Mississippi. My book, What Jane Austen's Characters Read and Why. I've been editor of the Jane Austen Society of North America's journals, Persuasions and Persuasions Online, since 2006.
I asked Dr. Ford how exactly an adolescent Jane would have been able to access quite so many books at such a young age, especially out in the countryside.
We have some letters that she writes where she talks about how her father's got some money and he's going to buy the poems of Cooper and he's going to buy Boswell's Journey to the Hebrides and Boswell's Life of Johnson, and another point where He's bought this new novel by one of their neighbors, Arthur Fitz-Albini. So there are books coming into the house that way. Even when the farming economy was bad, and so he had to get rid of his carriage, he still put aside money to spend on books. That was kind of like the most important thing after food, probably. They also were members of circulating libraries throughout her life. And we have some letters that talk about this, and book societies as well. So you would pay a kind of membership fee, and then you were allowed to get a certain number of books at a time throughout the year. Also, in some of those books that we have from her, we can see that they were given to her by her uncle, James Leigh Perrott. He was fairly wealthy, and my guess is, since they have his book plate in them, or his signature, one of the two, but he must have read them and then passed them along to his reading niece. And then, of course, there seem to be a lot of books being passed around. If somebody gets a book, they're sharing it. Just as if somebody gets, like, the ladies' magazine, they're going to share that. There's a sort of community resourcing of reading materials. And you go to people's houses, and one of the ways of entertaining guests and being entertained is to read. Sometimes she's looking at plates, engravings that somebody has in their drawing room or their library. And there's one party she mentions where they have dinner, and some people then play cards, and some people are, talking, and she is sitting listening to her brother and somebody else read Dr. Jenner's pamphlet on the cowpox. So there's kind of an infinite number of ways that reading materials can cross her path.
Jane was still young and impressionable, but Cassandra was growing into adolescence. The Coopers had already found their Jane a new school in Reading, the Reading Ladies' Boarding School, known in later history books as the Reading Abbey School. Cassandra was only a year behind Jane Cooper, and, like Jane Cooper, her parents believed that she needed a proper education. So in 1785, the Austens decided to send Cassandra away to join her cousin at school. Jane would remain in Steventon. But to Jane, there was no worse fate than to be separated permanently from her sister Cassandra. What would she do? Without Cassandra, Jane was the only girl in a household of boys. Besides, she had always been Cassandra's shadow. To be without her would be a crisis. Sure, she had almost just died from typhus, but to lose her sister now? The Austens thought her too young to attend a real school. It may have done well enough to send her to a relative like Mrs. Colley, but she was not quite ready for a finishing education. Jane was 9 when the decision was first made, and some girls did go away to school that young, but many families chose to wait a few more years before sending their daughters away. But Jane, the same Jane who walked all the way to meet her sister's coach, the same Jane who had survived typhus, would have her way. She put her foot down. She would go to school with Cassandra. This incident became a famous family story. According to one niece, upon recalling the situation many years later, Mrs. Austen famously remarked,
"If Cassandra's head had been going to be cut off, Jane would have hers cut off too."
There was no arguing with Jane. And so, at 9 years old, Jane traveled to Reading Abbey School. It would be the last time she would ever live away from her family. I have often heard the claim that Mr. Austen sent his girls away to clear room in the rectory for more students, believing that the cost of sending 2 girls to school would be more than compensated by the extra boys he could stuff in their room. I find this perspective quite cynical, because if Mr. Austen were to have such mercenary aims, then he likely would not have sent Jane and Cassandra to such a fine school. Mr. Austen had paid Mrs. Colley a total of £40 to care for both his daughters for the year. He would pay nearly that much for each girl at Reading Abbey School. And he paid extra so that they would be parlor boarders. That is, so that they would have special privileges, such as better accommodations, and even perhaps extra classes. A school like Reading Abbey must have delighted a young, imaginative girl like Jane. The original abbey was built in the 12th century and later destroyed in the 16th by Henry VIII. Its ruins, however, became a central monument of the town in Reading. A few of its outer buildings survived, including one known as the Inner Gate. The Inner Gate, with its sharply arched Gothic windows and octagonal towers, had seen its fair share of horrible histories. In 1539, the last abbot had been hanged, drawn, and quartered outside of the gate. But by 1785, the building adjoining the gate had already served as a girls' school for 3 decades. The Austens did not know it yet. No one knew it yet. But Reading Abbey School would gain quite the literary reputation. Jane Austen was not the only famous writer to emerge from its halls, although she would definitely become its most famous attendee. The alumni of Reading Abbey School includes no less than 7 successful female writers, the most famous of which, other than Jane Austen, is Mary Russell Mitford. If the name Mary Russell Mitford sounds familiar, it's because she was the daughter of the same Mary Russell, who had lived at Ashe and had moved out after her father's death, the one who did not like Jane Austen. Caroline Lamb was another famous alumni, or should I say, infamous. Her novel, Glenavon, was a thinly veiled society piece that skewered poet Lord Byron and coined the famous saying about him, mad, bad, and dangerous to know. And then there was Mary Sherwood Butt, who traveled to India and wrote evangelical stories. Her recollections of Reading Abbey School gives us the best picture of what it was like to attend.
The house itself was exceedingly interesting. It consisted of a gateway with rooms above, and on each side of it a vast staircase, of which the balustrades had been gilt. The gateway itself stood without the garden walls, upon the Forbury, or oaken green, but the rest of the house was encompassed by a beautiful old-fashioned garden, where the children played under tall trees in hot summer evenings. Round 2 parts of this garden was an artificial embankment, from the top of which we looked down upon magnificent ruins of the church begun by Henry I.
The schoolmistress was a woman known as Mrs. La Tournelle. That was not her real name. Her real name was Sarah Hackett. And that wasn't even the name she was born with. She wasn't married either. But the French pseudonym was a smart bit of marketing. It was expected that young women would learn French at school, and Mrs. La Tournelle had likely realized that more parents would send their daughters to her if they thought she could teach them proper French. Not that Mrs. La Tournelle spoke French. In fact, she avoided it whenever possible. Mrs. La Tournelle's shifting identity seemed to match her eccentric personality. She had a cork leg, and no one knew why. One student, who attended only a couple years later than Jane, described her as hardly 70, but she was actually only about 48 when Jane arrived. Perhaps it was the dated way she dressed, with her muslin apron and plentiful ruffles, that made her seem older than her years. She may have greeted Jane and Cassandra in the parlor, where embroidered pieces of tombs and weeping willows decorated the walls and porcelain miniatures cluttered the mantel. The Gothic kitsch of the parlor may have appealed to a young Jane, who was beginning to fill her own head with the marvelous stories she read in books. A student was likely sent down to collect Jane and Cassandra. At this point, they would have bid farewell to their father and gone up the narrow staircase to see their lodgings. Despite being parlor boarders, Jane and Cassandra may still have had to share a bed or even a room with up to 10 other girls. Every Saturday was bath night, probably to get ready for Sunday church. In the morning, Jane would awake and join her classmates in the schoolroom. There, they would have breakfast. Then, Mrs. La Tournelle and her niece would lead prayer in the center of the room. Enforcement of prayer time was reportedly non-existent. As long as the girls showed up before prayer ended, their attendance counted. Then Mrs. Luttrell's niece would read aloud pieces from the Bible. Prayer time was sacred, but not as sacred as wash day. If the washerwoman was there that day, Mrs. Luttrell would grow anxious and hiss over Brown's reading.
Make haste! Make haste!
Mornings would be filled with classes. It is hard to say what Jane was taught here. She was probably too young to receive serious instruction in French, but she had some exposure to Greek and Latin. Dancing, drawing, or possibly even music lessons may have been provided. None of this was enough to make a girl clever, just enough to make her accomplished. As a parlor boarder, Jane could take her supper and tea in the tomb-adorned parlor. Mrs. Luttrell, her assistants, and any adult guests would dine in the parlor as well, which suggests that Jane may have overheard some adult gossip. As Mary Butt wrote,
Whenever Mrs. Latournelle had an opportunity of holding forth, she spoke of plays and play acting and green-room anecdotes and the private life of actors. There was at that time a certain set of people in or near London who seemed to think of nothing but the affairs of the theatre.
Thus, Austen's education was not always strictly formal. Once morning classes were over, the girls were on their own, with precious little supervision. You see, apparently the staff did not work afternoons at Reading Abbey School, nor did they really seem to worry much about the girls.
No human being ever took the trouble to inquire where we spent the rest of the day between our meals, whether we gossiped in one turret or another, whether we lounged about the garden or out of the window above the gateway. No one so much as said, "Where have you been?"
During these precious hours, Jane was on her own. Her social life would have been rich, although young Jane may have been more bookish than chatty. Although she was young, she could depend on Cassandra and Jane Cooper to entertain her. She might have gone out into the gardens to play with the other girls, or to sit in the turrets and gossip. Occasionally, they would have been taken out to functions in town, such as balls with the nearby boys' school. And there were wonders contained within the school as well. An auction of the school's assets in 1794 lists among them a magic lantern fitted with historical plates. A magic lantern was a sort of primitive slide deck, which would project images onto a wall using candlelight. There was also a pianoforte and props for a theatrical, both things that we know an older Jane expressed interest in. Perhaps a younger Jane did as well. But it is also likely that she filled those hours with reading.
I don't really imagine her as much as a kid reading literature for children. I think she was always reading for adults. My name is Misty Kruger, and I'm a professor at the University of Maine at Farmington. I've published a lot of essays on Jane Austen, but I'm currently writing a book on Austen and monsters. She also really enjoyed 18th century poetry. The big three that stand out would be Shakespeare. So yes, young Jane Austen was reading Shakespeare and probably enjoying seeing Shakespeare plays performed. Her two fiction authors that she absolutely loved was Frances Burney and then Samuel Richardson. And these, again, are not books written for children. Anything written by Frances Burney that Austen was reading, not written for children. Same with Samuel Richardson. And for anyone who knows Samuel Richardson, his books are huge. And I don't mean huge like big in size, but I mean many, many pages and volumes, and some even in a series. So she was really a voracious reader and reading really big books, very long books.
As 1785 turned into 1786, the winter turned cold. Snow piled up on Forbury Green. At some point during this period, Edward Austen and Edward Cooper came to visit their respective sisters. The two Edwards checked out the girls from school for the day and took them to a nearby tavern at Reading Inn. This shocked later generations of Austens, who thought the tavern too inappropriate a scene for such young girls. There, the girls dined with their brothers and caught up on family news. Because we don't know when this visit took place, we can't quite say what the girls learned from this visit. But whether they learned it from their brother or not, the girls would soon discover that their father was in dire straits. Recent expansions at his farm had left him dependent on a good return on his harvest. But instead of a good harvest, he got a long winter. The brutal season destroyed his finances, and resources were stretched thin yet again for the Austen family. When the girls returned in July, they had lost their privileged status as parlor boarders. No more tea and celebrity gossip in the parlor with Mrs. Luttrell. They also attended knowing that this would be their last term. In December, they would leave Reading Ladies' Boarding School forever. It is difficult to say whether this news pleased or disappointed little Jane. Some have wondered whether Mrs. Goddard's school in Emma was a reflection of Jane's own experience in Reading. Here's the passage to let you decide for yourself.
Mrs. Goddard was the mistress of a school, a real, honest, old-fashioned boarding school, where a reasonable quantity of accomplishments were sold at a reasonable price, and where girls might be sent to be out of the way and scramble themselves into a little education without any danger of coming back prodigies.
Of course, Jane would likely never admit it, but she did return a prodigy. Or maybe she already was one. But she wouldn't be the only one to come out of Reading Abbey School. How did such a chaotic and, quote, excessively incautious administration, with its questionable attendance policies and liberating afternoon sessions, manage to produce not just Jane Austen, but also an additional 7 successful female authors, will remain a great historical mystery. For now, Jane was back at Steventon. We cannot say if she was relieved or disappointed to be back after her 18-month stint away. What does a young girl do when she no longer has the excitement and bustle of school? How does she spend her long days at home when there are no more lessons to be attended? What does she do with all of the experience of different people and different places? The answer for Jane Austen was simple. She begins to write. Thanks for listening to Finding Jane Austen. If you liked today's episode, please leave a review on your favorite podcast app. It helps us spread the love of Austen. Finding Jane Austen is a joint production of Revolutionary Histories and Primary Source Media. The series is researched and written by me, Dr. Ann Ferdig. My executive producers are Jeanette Patrick and Jim Ambusky. Our thanks to our scholars, Kim Simpson, Susan Allen Ford, and Misty Kruger, for their contributions to this episode. And to our voice actors, Emily Brady, Grace Mallon, and Adam Smith. Subscribe to Finding Jane Austen on your favorite podcast app. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.
Tired of your car insurance rate going up, even with a clean driving record? You're not alone. That's why there's Jerry, your proactive insurance assistant. Jerry compares rates side by side from over 50 top insurers and helps you switch with ease. Jerry even tracks market rates and alerts you when it's best to shop. No spam calls, no hidden fees. Drivers who save with Jerry could save over $1,300 a year. Switch with confidence. Download the Jerry app or visit jerry.ai/Libsyn today. That's JERRY.ai/LIBSYN.